nous allons donc reprendre pour le dernier panel de ce séminaire, donc, qui est intitulé « À quoi ressemblent les scénarios à venir pour l'Ukraine et comment l'architecture de sécurité de l'Europe devrait-elle s'adapter à ces scénarios ?» Et pour donc modérer ces échanges, nous avons le plaisir et l'honneur de pouvoir compter sur Ondrej Ditrych de l'EU Institute for Security Studies. Le docteur Ondrej Ditrych est analyste principal donc, à l'Institut de l'Union européenne pour les études de sécurité, où il dirige l'analyse de la Russie et du voisinage oriental. Il a auparavant été directeur de l'Institut des Relations internationales de Prague, un institut public de recherche rattaché au ministère des Affaires étrangères de la République tchèque. Il enseigne la rivalité entre grandes puissances à Sciences Po Paris et il a également occupé le poste de professeur associé en relations internationales à l'Université Charles de Prague, ainsi qu'enseignant à l'Université de Copenhague et à la VU Amsterdam, tout en étant aussi chercheur invité aux séries à Sciences Po, à la Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik et boursier Fulbright au Belfer Center de l'Université Harvard. Il a également travaillé comme analyste au sein du CHEP de l'OTAN et il est titulaire d'un master en sciences politiques et d'un doctorat en relations internationales de l'Université Charles de Prague, ainsi que d'un master en philosophie de l'Université de Cambridge. Je laisse maintenant la parole donc au docteur Ondrej Ditrych.
Alors, merci beaucoup pour cette introduction. Bon après-midi à toutes et à tous. If you allow me, I will mostly moderate in English. Good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to this panel on scenarios of the conflict, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, and also the implication this has for the European security architecture. I believe we have an excellent panel to discuss difficult questions related to the topic, starting from our immediate left, and I hope our panelists will excuse me. I will shorten the introductions somewhat, but the names I think speak for themselves. We have Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former commander of U.S. Army Europe. And SACEUR, and currently distinguished fellow with Globsec in Prague, also a member of the International Advisory Board of the new Strategic Center in Bucharest and the Warsaw Security Forum in Poland. To my further left, Professor Christian Lobrecht, who's a professor at the Royal Military College, and also, I understand, a visiting researcher at Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies currently. Further to my left, Carrie Lynn Nadkivel, Director for NATO and Europe in the Policy Group of Canada's Department of National Defense. And last but not least, François-Marie Gougeon, Acting Assistant Secretary General for Defense Policy and Planning of NATO, responsible for the Alliance Capacity and Force Planning, Policy Plans, a career military officer as well. So, jump straight to it. I would like to ask you General, for your sort of assessment of the battlefield situation, what we can expect, let's say, immediate to short term, and what implications it has for potential scenarios of the conflict, and we take it from this sort of foundation upwards, if we may.
So let me start at the end and then come back and explain why. So if you don't remember anything, this is going to be my recommendation to my Canadian and European allies and friends. And I have to say, thanks to all of you who have congratulated the United States on our Independence Day. Today is the 249th anniversary of our Declaration of Independence. We didn't win it for another 7 years. So you declared independence, but it took 7 years of fighting, mostly defeats, until Yorktown, and then still two more years of negotiation before the British finally agreed and left us on our own. That would not have been possible without our French, without people like the Marquis de Lafayette, and also the great French Navy, that helped us in our final victory, but also Germans like Baron von Steuben, who helped develop our corps of non-commissioned officers, which made us into a much better army, or Polish patriots like Kazimierz Pulaski, who was the father of American cavalry and saved the life of George Washington on the battlefield, or Tadeusz Kosciuszko, a great engineer, also a great person. He was given slaves as a thank you at the end of the Revolution, and he immediately freed them all. So setting a great example, not only of courage and engineering expertise, which we did not have in our new country, but also a humane person. And then the Canadians, you don't have to worry. We invaded Canada one time and we lost. We're never trying that again. So don't pay too much attention to what the president asked that he says. We can learn. Although we welcome all the Canadian hockey players that want to join, that play in the NHL or whatever. They're always welcome. Okay. But it is hard as an American right now. This is a commemoration of a day when we declared our independence from a king, and now we have a president who wants to be a king. But democracy is this is not a ballet. This is rugby football all down day. And Tobias, your words earlier, very, very poignant. And you do have to fight for it. It's almost a cliche to say freedom isn't free. No kidding. It is not free. And we are where we are because too many of us took it for granted that it would always be like that. And now we're in a very difficult place. And I think that it's going to get worse before it gets better. We will get better. Where it's always crazy. There's always a degree of chaos in the U.S. This is not the norm now, but and when we come out the other side of this, it's not going to be the same. I think many of you will forever it'll be hard to undo the damage that's been done to trust and confidence and expectations. But I still have too much belief in most of the people that will eventually get it right. But we will need confidence and support from our European and Canadian friends. Okay. So what is my recommendation at the end of my very short piece here? First of all, don't be scared of a Russian collapse. I think everybody in Europe, and not everybody, but most people in Europe and in Canada and other places, including in Washington, are terrified that Putin might actually fall, that the regime may collapse. And so we hesitate like, oh my God, that would be horrible. It already happened at the end of the Cold War, and the Soviet Union collapsed. And what happened? Millions of people became free. Nobody lost control of nuclear weapons, except the Ukrainians, who would never make that same mistake again. But we were not prepared. So we should not fear the collapse of Ukrainian victory and the possible collapse of the Putin regime, but we should prepare for it. We should be thinking about, okay, there will be, of course, the Chechens will start killing people everywhere. Already today, we know that Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Turkey or the Azeris and the Armenians are even working together against Moscow now. So there will be a lot of places and opportunity for people that want to finally be free. We should prepare for that. I'm not saying, we have a terrible record on regime change, so don't think that's what I'm talking about, but we should prepare for what are the implications. Secondly, the best investment anybody in Europe could make would be in the best defense investment any of us can make, including Canada, is in Ukraine. Help Ukraine defeat Russia. Then you don't have to have a gazillion tanks and ships and planes to defend against Russia. Because the Ukrainians, they're not asking for one soldier or sailor to come there. They just want the tools. And then, of course, the economic support that we should be given. I would say to Europe, please get your self-confidence back. When I got mocked a little bit yesterday by the gentleman on the first panel, but if you add together all the capabilities, the industry, the technology, the science, the industry of all of the EU, plus Norway, plus UK, plus Canada, it dwarfs Russia. I mean, it's not even close. Not even close. There's so much talk about 5% or 2%. Of course, That's important, but you can put a sign on your border and say, we're 5%. That's not going to stop one BMP or tank from driving into your country, okay? That sign will not stop anything. What will stop them is an alliance, this a phalanx of democratic countries that are armed to the teeth and that have women and men that are trained to do their job. That will stop all of Russia's efforts. 3 scenarios. Worst case, total Ukrainian collapse. It only happens if we quit, all of us quit, and they lose the political will to keep fighting. It's just too much. That's the worst case. What are the implications for Europe? Millions with an M refugees additionally coming into Poland, Germany, Romania, and all of the rest of Europe. Millions more. And it will be impossible. Nobody will invest in reconstruction, which means continued food disruption, energy disruption. And by the way, the Russian army will absorb at least 200,000 trained soldiers into their army. Not because Ukrainians want to do it, but they will be absorbed, pressed into service the way the Russians have always done it. So the Russian army actually will grow, and then they'll be headed to Moldova, and the Romanians have already said, we're not going to just sit back and let Moldova. And then the Poles are not going to hide behind the Vistula River. So it's NATO conflict if we allow this to happen. Not just bad luck for Ukrainians. The best case, of course, is Ukraine defeats Russia, 1991 borders. That happens if all of us say we want Ukraine to defeat Russia. Not this ridiculous we're with you for as long as it takes. What an empty bullshit statement that nobody believes, and we didn't do it. We haven't done it. But no, we want you to win. It's our policy, and we're going to give you everything you need, and we're going to stop Russia's illegal shadow fleet vessels from going in and out of the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, and we're going to give Ukraine the ability to hit oil and gas infrastructure, and our target is 25% of Russia's GDP. We're going to wreck it. That's how Ukraine wins. And then Russia learns to live inside their own borders and respect the borders of everybody else. And then we can play hockey, we can buy their wheat, we can do all kinds of other things, including in the Arctic. The third, and this is, I think, the most likely, is that Ukraine, because we never do actually commit to helping them win, but most European countries, Canada, and sometimes U.S. will support Ukraine enough to keep them in the fight, and they adopt a strategy of denial, and they take the Israeli approach. They become the Israel of Europe without nuclear weapons. The GUR will hunt down Russian officers day and night. For the rest of their life, senior Russian officers will be looking over their shoulder and checking under their car for the rest of their life because the GUR is going to get them. That's from now until they're all gone. Ukrainians will continue to target oil and gas infrastructure, just like they attacked these several shadow fleet vessels in the Aegean Sea just the other day. They're going to continue to they're going to get better and better and better on long-range weapons to hit Russia's air bases, defense industry, and the Ukrainians have already demonstrated not 1 square kilometer of Russia is safe. They've already shown the world they can touch every square kilometer of Russia. And they also have killed Russians in Syria and in Africa. So this is the future for Russia and for us, unless we decide we want to help Ukraine win. And that's the best outcome for everybody in this room.
Many thanks for that. Before we move on, could you develop a little bit within this sort of third scenario that you described as most likely? What sort of pathways we can foresee in the immediate future? This is more about forecasting than foresight, like the best case, worst case, but really what's on the cards. Is there a way some sort of a ceasefire will be enacted? What about the U.S. administration, diplomatic efforts? Where do you see this headed? What are we going to see, on the battlefield? Let's say in the next year.
So if nothing happens different externally, then at this conference next year, the situation on the battlefield is going to look about like it does right now. Russia does not have the ability to overwhelm or break through Ukrainian defenders. And Ukraine does not have the ability to push Russia out. So if nothing happens externally, like significant increase in new capabilities, or we finally get serious about disrupting Russia's ability to export oil and gas to India and China, which pays for the war, then I think we're going to be about where we are now. President Putin, supposedly he and President Trump had a phone call yesterday. And by the way, notice after every phone call that Putin has with Trump, the worst possible air attacks on Ukrainian cities happen within 24 hours. I'm not saying that Trump authorizes or approves it, but this is how much respect Putin has for President Trump. F you. And so to your question, I think the Trump administration's approach to negotiation was doomed to failure from the start because he nor his team of geniuses did not understand or appreciate the nature of this war. I mean, you remember that terrible day in the Oval Office when he's yelling at President Zelensky, "You got no cards," clearly demonstrated that he does not understand why people fight. That even though Russia had all the advantages in numbers, and Trump even said, why would you attack a country that's so much bigger? Well, first of all, they didn't attack. Second of all, this is why people fight. I mean, you could say the Taliban had no cards, but they defeated us. You could say the Viet Cong had no cards, but they defeated us. You could say the Americans had no cards, but we defeated the British. So that is why when they start off, the art of the deal, the first thing that Secretary Rubio says, well, Ukraine, you're going to have to give up some land. What kind of a deal is that? I mean, you start by telling the Ukrainians. So that's why, I'm sorry, I took off on an excursion here, but I think that approach is not going to work. And then Trump says the other day, well, this is really hard. And so he then shifted to attacking Iran. So I think that I see no hope, unfortunately, for the U.S. to lead an effort. This is where President Macron, Prime Minister Starmer, Bundeskanzler Merz, and President Tusk, Prime Minister Tusk, those four, I think, are going to have to really lead the effort to pressure the Russians. And the Russians will never come to the negotiating table until they begin to feel the economic pressure of the shutdown of their oil and gas exports.
Thanks for that. I think the question is whether we can have that sort of pressure without the U.S. I think from the IR perspective, it's quite an interesting case of a great power bandwagoning with a weaker enemy.
Okay.
Weaker power.
The EU is a superpower. It should act like a superpower.
Fair enough. Now let's move on. I will take a little bit of jumping over Christian for just now and go to Carrie. Ask for your analysis, please.
Absolument, merci. Mesdames et messieurs, ladies and gentlemen, ça m'a fait énorme plaisir d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui. Merci pour l'invitation. Je suis ravie de pouvoir partager quelques idées sur l'Ukraine. C'est un enjeu essentiel qui est vraiment au cœur de notre sécurité collective. Je vais organiser mes pensées dans un 3x3 format. Alors, ça veut dire 3 scénarios, 3 adaptations suggérées et puis 3 implications du Canada comme bonus. Mais avant de parler de ces scénarios possibles pour l'Ukraine, j'aimerais souligner quelques éléments à prendre en compte afin d'orienter la réflexion à ce sujet. À l'heure actuelle, l'Europe renforce ses efforts pour assurer sa propre sécurité, alors que la posture de l'États-Unis vis-à-vis du continent continue d'évoluer. Et je suis complètement d'accord avec Tobias qui nous rappelait que c'est moins un wake-up call qu'un snooze button qu'on a poussé trop. In this context, while this is happening, Canada fully recognizes the value of a comprehensive ceasefire in Ukraine and the urgency of starting dialogue. And we welcome U.S. efforts in this regard, with the important caveat that neither as an alliance nor as individual allies should we be pursuing a ceasefire or a negotiated settlement to the war at any cost. We've seen no evidence that President Putin is serious. In fact, reportedly yesterday, he told President Trump that he is not. And indeed, he's deliberately dragging out negotiations in order to maximize his territorial gains on the battlefield, however minor and at such great cost. It's clear that the Kremlin today seeks the full subjugation of Ukraine and a rewrite of the Euro-Atlantic security architecture through violence and aggression. And I agree with all of the panelists that have come before to say that if we fail to support Ukraine, we acquiesce to Putin's vision for our region. We tacitly confirm the legitimacy of his approach, and we bring the Russian threat closer to NATO boundaries. Our security will be diminished, and other would-be aggressors may be emboldened. Now, escalation risks are also important. We haven't talked a lot about them over the last day and a half, but certainly in official circles, it's something we talk about a lot. Canada, as a non-nuclear power, does consider itself to have a role to play. We may not be able to manage escalation on our own, but any individual ally, including Canada, can escalate things, either intentionally or unintentionally, and it's something we're very mindful about as a result. But even as we look to manage our own policies, operations, responses with a view to the risks of escalation, we are also conscious that there is perhaps the most significant escalation risk would be an emboldened Russia that assumes it can directly confront a NATO member state or NATO member states without any credible or meaningful response. By supporting Ukraine now, we're seeking to avoid a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO. Such a confrontation would fundamentally reshape Europe's security architecture and demand an immediate and large-scale response by the alliance. So, as setting the stage, I'll move to the 3x3. A few broad possible scenarios for Ukraine. I don't think there'll be much disagreement about them. And in fact, one of the interesting things from a policy perspective, I think, is that while we can't predict the future, we certainly can't control the future, we can plan for it. And in Canada, at least, the policy team is trying to do that by focusing first on the things we believe will not change, and second on the things that we can control as a member of the alliance and as an individual partner for Ukraine. So the first possible scenario is a prolonged war of attrition. It's the one that Putin is pursuing, and it's the one where we're currently at and have been for 3 years. We also consider it to be the most likely path in the near term. It means continued fighting with neither side achieving a decisive breakthrough, although there will be developments and there is an active line of conflict. To be clear, from our perspective, the current trend for Ukraine at this stage on the battlefield is negative, but we do not consider it to be catastrophic. The armed forces of Ukraine are continuing to hold the line. They're inflicting significant losses on Russians. And by terrible necessity, they're innovating battlefield technologies and operational concepts that can keep their forces in the fight against a much larger and less agile enemy. And equally impressively, they have reinvented the defense innovation cycle. They've mobilized state and private sector capital to establish an industrial base that can move in tandem with the needs of its armed forces in order to maintain mission readiness. This is an incredible achievement by Ukraine and something that I think all NATO allies are looking to learn from. That said, in a prolonged war of attrition, Ukraine will very likely to continue to experience incremental territorial losses unless there is a significant increase in military and economic support from its partners. This is precisely the scenario that Putin prefers and that he's working to impose and that continues to present risks. The second scenario that Canada worries about is a false peace. And while bringing a pause to large-scale fighting, it could resemble a ceasefire without real lasting peace, similar to what we saw during the war in the Donbass. This would almost certainly provide Russia with an opportunity to reconstitute, to rearm, and then resume hostilities at the time and location of its choosing. Under this scenario, Ukraine would require support from partners to enable it to reconstitute its forces and build credible deterrence against Russia for the long term. With these two unpalatable scenarios in mind, I'll return to my comment that Canada supports efforts, however unrealistic at this stage, to open discussions for a negotiated settlement between Russia and Ukraine as a desirable alternative to those other two when conditions permit. The terms of a sustainable and lasting agreement are difficult, if not impossible, to conceptualize at this stage, given how far apart the parties are and the apparent determination of the Kremlin to stay the course. But negotiations are eminently possible in principle, and in fact, they are the primary way that wars end. Should we reach a stage where Russia can adapt and will adapt its maximalist demands and accept the reality of Ukraine's right to exist, a negotiated settlement could be a positive outcome. On the other hand, a continued intransigent approach that insists on Ukraine's full subservience cannot work. But under this scenario, and looking forward to setting the conditions for productive ceasefire negotiations, Canada recognizes the role of credible security guarantees as an essential support to a sustainable and lasting peace. The work that has been led by France and the UK on a coalition of the willing in particular has been supported enthusiastically by Canada and many other allies, and we see it as so important in this regard as an essential complement to any peace negotiations and possibly the best means to deter future Russian aggression. And I should note that it's important that these discussions also are happening at the leader level, which they are, which is a strong signal both to Russia but also to the United States that we are willing to do the work required. But they are added to by real military planning at the operational level to make sure that we're prepared for any outcome should the need arise. So in the face of all this, how can Canada adapt? How can the Euro-Atlantic adapt? Well, I've got 3 thoughts. The first is to position ourselves to support Ukraine for the foreseeable future and in a holistic manner. And this is the part that we can control the most. Even following a negotiated settlement or a ceasefire, Ukraine will urgently look to reconstitute its forces and expand its capabilities to build credible deterrence and prevent future aggression, whether a decade or 2 decades in the future. We're all operating under conditions of extreme uncertainty, and it's useful to focus on the things that seem the most consistent and the things we can control. And we do think that Ukraine's needs in terms of training, donations, and other forms of economic, financial, and military support are things we can and should count on being consistent for the long term. So for Canada, we're trying to plan on multiple time horizons. In the short term, we continue to provide Ukraine with both donations of military equipment as well as military training as central to ensure that Ukraine can pursue negotiations with Russia at the right moment from the strongest possible position. Canada has been training Ukrainian forces consistently since 2014, first inside Ukraine and after 2022 in several locations around Europe and the UK. The Canadian Armed Forces have trained almost 45,000 Ukrainian personnel to date, and we do not believe that any of the scenarios, from prolonged conflict to negotiated settlement, will change Ukraine's need for CAF training or Canada's intent to provide it as long as it's welcomed. For the medium term, Prime Minister Carney has clearly signaled Canada's intent to leverage our strengths to support the France and UK-led discussions on the coalition of the willing for Ukraine, and to engage wholeheartedly in the military planning led by our chiefs of defence. In the meantime, and for the longer term, Canada will be guided by its bilateral agreement with Ukraine under the Canada-Ukraine Strategic Security Partnership signed in Kyiv in February 2024. That agreement sets out 13 pillars for a long-term comprehensive bilateral cooperation to facilitate Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic integration and facilitate peace for all of its citizens. It goes beyond military assistance. It sets out cooperative pillars to do things, for example, like advance reconstruction, including demining, support economic recovery, enhance cyber resilience, safeguard energy security, and other things. So we need to decide what role we're going to play amid all of this uncertainty, look for the consistent factors, and to pursue them as vigorously as we can. The second adaptation that I think is already underway is thinking through how to support Ukraine's sustainable defense capacity. Canada will do its part to signal to Russia that it can't wait us out militarily. Our military support will be multifaceted, including not only donations of equipment, but also institutional reform, effective and ongoing force generation assistance, and integration into Euro-Atlantic structures. For instance, through the NATO Security Assistance and Training for Ukraine, or NSATU, allies and partners are better coordinating the provision of military training, equipment, and logistics support to Ukraine. And Canada is very pleased to be a leading contributor of personnel and funding to NSATU, including by assigning a Canadian Brigadier General to lead its training coordination cell. Likewise, in the Ukraine Defence Contact Group capability coalitions, of which Canada is a member of 4, we're working multilaterally to both sustain military donations to Ukraine and support the AFU's capability development for and in the long term. And finally, under the Canada-Ukraine Strategic Security Partnership, we have agreed important provisions for bilateral defense industrial cooperation between our 2 countries. Canada is somewhat behind some other allies in this process, but we're very optimistic about what the future might bring. We've been pleased to contribute to Ukraine's industrial capacity through the Danish model, and we're actively engaged with a number of allies and with Ukraine on how to connect industrial capacity and innovation through cooperation between Ukrainian and Canadian companies. Our goal is to grow commercial opportunities that can continue amid and beyond this current war. And third, in a larger sense, Canada seeks to adapt by becoming more agile and integrated inside the Euro-Atlantic architecture. I agree with some of the speakers earlier today and yesterday that challenged the idea that minilateralism or multilateralism are either-or propositions. The current complexity of our security environment means we need to use all of the tools at our disposal. It's not enough to walk and chew gum. We're likely going to have to chew gum, dance, juggle, and do math at the same time. And Canada is doing its best to adapt to that posture. A few weeks ago, Prime Minister Carney, accompanied by Minister McGuinty and Foreign Minister Anand, confirmed Canada's direction of travel at the Canada-EU summit in Brussels. Among other commitments, we agreed to a Canada-EU security and defense partnership that will broaden and deepen our defense engagement with the EU on security matters as that institution develops its own new approach to fast-moving changes in the security environment. There will be a particular focus from Canada on industrial cooperation, on joint procurements, and interoperability. These are high priorities. And we look forward to Canada's swift confirmation as a third-party partner in Readiness 2030. In the broader sense, and this is some advice, I guess, to European member states and European allies, Canada thinks that NATO-EU complementarity will deliver critical benefits to all of our individual supports to Ukraine in particular. Canada sees benefits for all allies in the work that the EU is already doing to strengthen NATO's European pillar. Canada may not be a European country, but we are, as we heard from the ambassador, the most European of the non-European countries. We are a close and enduring partner, and most importantly, we have mutual security interests and shared values. Both, in equal measure, will drive our collaboration in focused investment, collaborative capability production, joint training, and operational cooperation, both in Ukraine and in other missions. Alors, 3 implications. Pour le Canada, qu'est-ce que cela implique? Numéro 1, nous devons renforcer notre partenariat avec l'Ukraine et non seulement notre aide. Le Canada est déterminé à travailler avec l'Ukraine et nos partenaires afin de garantir que l'Ukraine puisse développer et maintenir une posture d'autodéfense plus résiliente face à l'agression. Notre initiative d'engagement bilatéral en matière de sécurité, signée en 2024, est un élément clé de cette stratégie. Par ailleurs, la mission militaire du Canada en soutien à l'Ukraine, l'opération Unifier, est un modèle d'engagement concret qui a permis de former environ 45 000 membres des forces de sécurité de l'Ukraine depuis 2014. Plus de 10 000 d'entre eux ont été formés dans divers emplacements en Europe depuis l'invasion à grande échelle de l'Ukraine. Au sommet du G7 en Alberta il y a quelques semaines, le premier ministre Carney a annoncé que le Canada accroîtra une aide supplémentaire de 2 milliards de dollars à des fins militaires pour l'Ukraine. Ce financement servira notamment à financer l'achat de drones, de munitions et de véhicules blindés. Au total, nous avons dédié plus que 24 milliards de dollars en soutien intégral à l'Ukraine depuis 2022 et on est dédié à continuer cette aide. Continuant en ce qui a trait aux implications, le Canada restera un allié fiable à l'OTAN pendant que notre alliance se transforme. Le Canada se tient aux côtés de ses alliés de l'OTAN pour défendre la paix, la stabilité et la prospérité. Cela signifie investir dans notre propre défense afin de pouvoir contribuer de manière significative à garantir notre sécurité et celle de nos alliés, en soutien de nos obligations non seulement sous l'article 5, mais aussi sous l'article 3. Le mois dernier, le premier ministre Carney a annoncé que le gouvernement réinvestira afin de rebâtir et réarmer les forces armées canadiennes. Cette décision permettra au Canada d'accélérer encore nos investissements dans les années à venir. Nous devons aussi démontrer notre détermination collective à maintenir une dissuasion forte contre toute agression, russe et autres. Et il faut que je mentionne qu'on pense beaucoup aussi aux Chine dans cet égard. Troisièmement, nous devons également approfondir et diversifier nos partenariats avec l'Europe. Pour ce qui est de notre relation avec l'Union européenne, il s'agit d'un moment charnière, alors que nous cherchons à renforcer notre coopération en tant que partenaire de confiance. La récente signature de notre partenariat en matière de sécurité et de défense avec l'Union européenne nous offre l'occasion d'accroître nos collaborations, notamment par l'intermédiaire de l'initiative Readiness 2030. In this light, Canada aims to play a mutually beneficial role with our European partners in multiple formats to help shape the future of Euro-Atlantic security, which we view as indivisible. That is to say, including the northern and western flanks formed by North America and the Canadian Arctic. Here, Canada brings a unique perspective, one that bridges North America and Europe, that serves our mutual security interests, and gives concrete form to our shared values and our norms. En conclusion, bien que l'environnement de sécurité européen soit confronté à des défis importants, il nous incombe à garantir l'avenir de l'Ukraine en suivant l'approche à la paix par la puissance. Comme notre Premier ministre le dit, it's not just about the strength of our values, but also about the value of our strength. Notre engagement envers la souveraineté et l'intégrité territoriale de l'Ukraine, ainsi qu'envers la sécurité euro-atlantique, reste ébranlable. Merci.
Merci, Gary. Thank you very much for the overview of Canadian government position, as well as sort of insight into how you think about the future trajectories and how your policy sort of is aligned with that. Let me go back to the scenarios that you outlined for just a bit, because you mentioned as one of the scenarios possibility of a negotiated settlement, right? You mentioned that that we shouldn't go for a ceasefire at any cost, but also that negotiations are possible. At the same time, it really looks like Mr. Putin is not interested in peace. You said so yourself, right? So how do we push him there? So what in your view, in your thinking, is sort of the pathway to, let's say, a sustainable negotiated settlement, which will not be peace, perhaps, because we may not have peace for a very long time, but will be something that will be at least conducive to some sort of long-term freezing of the conflict and safeguarding Ukraine's sovereignty, at least most of its territory. How do you see that?
Well, I think it probably won't be a very surprising answer, but the simple answer is that we push Russia to negotiation either by imposing punishment or at least minimizing gains and allowing time to do its work. Again, the support of partners to the Ukrainian armed forces is the most important thing. Allowing Ukraine to negotiate as required from a position of strength into a negotiation that it is comfortable with is something that Canada supports. Canada won't be able to do this alone, so I know it's just presented as quite easy. But the main thing is to allow continued minimization of Russian gains on the battlefield in order to create the conditions for some kind of dialogue, maybe not this year, maybe not next year. As the general mentioned, the American Revolution wasn't won in 1 or 2 years. It does, a war of attrition can eventually yield to ceasefire negotiations, but it takes patience and resolve, and that's probably our best path.
So what about the shadow fleet, going more assertively after the oil, as it was mentioned, critical revenue source for Russia's state budget, and by extension, Russia's war machine?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of those steps are valuable. I'm not an expert. I know at the G7 they've talked, and at NATO they've talked extensively about shadow fleet. Canada has been quite aggressive on the subject of sanctions and just announced a recent sanction package, again at the G7 summit held in Alberta a few weeks ago. It won't be enough without similar sanctions packages being considered in the EU and with the United States. But I'm not comfortable to claim that either of those solutions will be a silver bullet. Russia is quite a large power. It's a large economy. It does have an ally in North Korea and certainly some very close friends that share some of its interests in China, in Iran, and perhaps elsewhere. And it will adapt. It also has shown a great propensity to absorb economic setbacks in the name of its war in Ukraine. So I don't think we should mislead ourselves into thinking there's any single bullet. The pathway to a favorable settlement has to come through sustained and prolonged pressure.
Thank you for that. Let's stay in Canada now, but let's have perhaps more of an academic perspective, if it's fair to say. Christian, please, the floor is yours.
Look, I mean, on the ceasefire, look, Panmunjom took almost 4 years to negotiate, right? It's the Russians spent 10 years in Afghanistan, we spent 40 years in the Cold War. And we live in an age where people want immediate satisfaction, and these things just don't solve themselves sort of right away. Let me just, echoing the General's comments, read you a text from this morning. And the text reads, "Huge attack tonight. First time I've heard the F-16s over the city. It's from my son. My son took a year's leave from his job in Canada and is currently working for the Tony Blair Institute in Kyiv." So I get some first-hand experience there too. On Carrie Lynn's comment with regards to GDP, Russia's GDP is about the size of Canada's. And the reason I like to point this out is Canada and allied countries are making political decisions about the support they provide and how they oriented their means to what particular ends. We have the ability to end this war, and we have the ability to end this war quickly. These are political decisions. Yeah, we've taken democracy for granted. We spent 35 years taking democracy for granted, and now we're learning that democracy is fragile and that we need to defend it. And on that note, General, of course, you said it's 249 years since Declaration of Independence, of course, 250 years since George Washington took his troops and marched on Quebec City. So Canada is well acquainted with the realism of living next door to the United States. And as I always like to point out in these situations, we all know the Americans are best friends, whether we like it or not. So, but to the US credit also, you know, it's hard to be a superpower. And I think I have a whole lecture on foreign policy kind of thing that has that title. But if you want to know a little bit more about this, there's two great books, I think, that in particular people who are not Americans should read. Walter Russell Mead's book on special providence and the different schools of American foreign policy. We can debate whether there's 4 or 6 schools, but just understanding that Washington is a very competitive marketplace when it comes to public policy, including foreign policy. And Sam Huntington's, one of his lesser known books, The Promise of Disharmony, published in 1984, about the very complicated cacophony in the way people make policy in Washington. So anybody who thinks that foreign policy is made in the White House doesn't appreciate a whole lot about the complicated nature of policy making in the United States. You heard mention of the Wilfred Martin Center for European Studies. None of you will have likely heard of the Wilfred Martin Center. That's okay. The reason why that... So the Wilfred Martin Center is the political foundation of the EPP, the European People's Party, which holds the largest group in the European Parliament, holds over half the commissioners, and is in government or coalition in 14 out of 27 European Union countries. The reason I mention that is the Martin Center drafted the blueprint for what has now become the white paper on defense and is closely involved in its implementation. And so I've had a bit of a privilege to have some insights into that and have a lot of the conversations that we're having here. And I'm glad we're having these conversations because that's what democracy is ultimately about. I think there's a couple of perhaps, so I want to just make quick comments about Ukraine, Russia, the United States, Europe, and then sort of three ways forward. On Ukraine, I think on the earlier panel we heard that Ukraine is fighting for freedom. That's not exactly how any Ukrainian has explained this to me. Ukraine is fighting for its existence. Ukrainians remember the Holodomor, and they know exactly what's going to happen if Russia takes over Ukraine. This is why they're fighting in the way that they are. We also heard a comment that somehow NATO is Europe's army? I'd love to hear the general's views on that, but I think this is precisely the sort of comments that rile President Trump, because it shows a complete misunderstanding of the purpose of NATO, and NATO with its three pillars in North America, Europe, and the transatlantic space. And so I think there's still a lot of learning to be done in Europe about how it understands NATO. The reason why Ukraine cannot lose is, you already heard yesterday from Ondrej, Europe would end up with 15 million refugees. So if we think that 2015 was a political destabilizing for Europe, I don't think we want to play through this scenario. The Russians would end up with some very high-end equipment. We would get a massive spillover of small weapons into Europe and a massive spillover of organized crime. If that's the future we want to live in, then let's keep going with this sort of, too little to live, too much to die kind of approach to Ukraine. On Russia, we need to be very careful in Russia because we've gotten Russia wrong since at least 1994. And we need to be wary of politicians who continuously misinterpret Russia. In 1994, Putin made his famous point about that the collapse of the Soviet Union was sort of the greatest sort of geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. Ignoring World War I, ignoring World War II, ignoring the Holodomor, and ignoring the Holocaust. That should have been an early warning sign that this man has a rather skewed interpretation of how the world works. We also need to understand that we're talking a lot about the Baltic countries, but of course, as Carolyn would point out if she had more time, and perhaps in the conversation, that Russia can impose a host of strategic dilemmas in Europe in a host of areas in multiple domains. And so this is what Europe needs to prepare for. This idea we're going to put a bunch of more soldiers and equipment in the Baltic states and in Poland is not going to solve the issue. I also worry that as Putin gets older, his risk tolerance is growing, and is growing rapidly, because he's made it clear he wants to go down in Russian history. And I think we need to be prepared that the way that Putin has tested the West, and has tested the West in particular since 2008, and with Georgia after the Bucharest summit, that we need to be prepared for more tests. And I should also say, of course, that Ukraine has effectively been in a war with Russia since 2005. So this is the 20th anniversary of the war. Because, of course, in 2005, Putin actively started meddling in Ukrainian democracy. I think getting all these things wrong is what causes us then to lead to the wrong sort of inferences. And the wrong inferences have been drawn by the Clinton administration, the Obama administration, and the Biden administration. This is not to, in somehow, in any ways, apologize for the Trump administration's approach, but we've been living with 30 years of governments drawing the wrong inferences. The United States is not about to abandon Europe. The United States, like Canada, has keen interests in Europe and in European territorial integrity, in political stability, economic prosperity, and in social harmony. Because like Canada, they spent 2 world wars living with the consequences of what happens when any of that falls apart. Of course, I might point out that in both world wars, there was only one of those 2 countries in North America that was there from day one. So, again, I think there's a lesson to be drawn here for the Trump administration. It can often take America a little while to come around. What is it that the famous Winston Churchill quote, right? The Americans will make all the wrong decisions until they make the right one. So I think, again, a little bit of patience might help us in that regard. And then there was a comment about a hope that the U.S. will sort of revert to multilateralism. The U.S. has never been a multilateralist country. The U.S. has always been unilateralist. The Biden administration might have been unilateralism with a smile. The Trump administration might be unilateralism with a frown, but it's always been U.S. unilateralism. And the U.S. leverages multilateralism to achieve its particular unilateral interests. That's a very different, I think, approach. On Europe, the Zeitenwende. The Zeitenwende was not about sort of getting Germany somehow ready for war in Ukraine. To the contrary, the Zeitenwende was an assumption by Olaf Scholz that the war is going to take a couple of weeks and Ukraine is going to collapse. Canada, interesting enough, knew that that wasn't going to happen because it had trained Ukrainian soldiers and officers and knew how resilient they were. Same in this country, right? Emmanuel Macron, who rather a latecomer to Ukraine, So all that to say is, European politicians have a lot to own here. In terms of undercapitalization, I don't understand the sort of European the sky is falling because Trump isn't providing Patriot missiles. So just to give you the numbers, so for the last 35 years, Europe and Canada have spent collectively $500 billion less a year on defense than the United States. The delta on that is $20 trillion, and that explains the difference between what the United States can offer and what allies and partners are offering. So this is an opportunity to make up for undercapitalizing. And now we sit here and we complain about how the United States is handling international security. I'm simply flabbergasted. We live in the world that we created with the political decisions that we made in Berlin, in Paris, but also the decisions that we made over the last 30 years to leave international security up to the Americans. And if we don't like what this world is looking like, and if we don't like what the Americans are doing, it's up to us to invest in the instruments of statecraft that actually allow us to do things differently. And I think there's a bit of an awakening here in Europe, as people have rightly pointed out. I always like to point out that Russia is a regional power with global ambitions. Europe is a global power with regional ambitions. So, maybe this is an opportunity for actually to make a difference. So what needs to be done? First, I think we need to generate a lot more forces, in particular in the Russian periphery. Now, how do we do this when countries such as Germany have a really hard time to get their head around conscription, or mandatory military service? How do you surge? You optimize. We have lots of soldiers along the southern flank that sit in garrison because they don't have equipment and aging equipment and so forth. The European Union, with its financial instruments and regulations, can provide incentives to make sure that those countries move some of their soldiers up to in particular, the Russian periphery, Baltics, Poland, and so forth, both as a deterrent, but also as a matter of just, if they're going to sit in garrison anyways, let's put them up there and let's make sure people have the opportunity to exercise and to train together. And that's, I think, how we start to build a more Europeanization of militaries and of working together. So there's a lot of opportunities here. And then I would say, we'll do the same thing with the Ukrainians. Why don't we bring the Ukrainians into the mission that we have? Let's show that the Ukrainians are permanently integrated into the European security architecture. Let's bring them into our enhanced forward presence, our forward bases and so forth, and let's integrate them and send a clear signal to Russia that nobody's going anywhere. The second is we need to have a conversation about flexible deterrence and escalation ladders, because of course Europe and the European Union doesn't have either. And the reason they need the United States is because the United States can escalate, and it can escalate flexibly. I'll give you a couple of examples of how the European Union can start to build escalation. If the European Union, so to the European Union's credit, they're generating 2 million rounds of artillery shells this year, and they're at 80% of that, so I'm confident that they're going to get to those 2 million. But they can generate large stocks of artillery shells in Poland, for instance. One way to escalate is to move those shells, if the Russians start to build up on the frontiers, to move those shells to the Baltic countries. There's lots of options like this where Europe can escalate if it builds the capacities. Europe also needs the capacity to escalate horizontally and vertically. Every time Russia cuts a cable, why don't the Europeans cut a Russian cable? Or
We have to abide by law.
Hang on.
Because we are not a dictatorship.
Well, hang on.
I mean,
Hang on.
this is
Yeah.
really awkward.
Let's let him finish the argument, and then we can engage.
I already know that that's sort of the retort that's going to come. We do this in cyberspace all the time. So we have other means than to cut Russian cables. What I'm pointing out is we're not utilizing the full capabilities that Europe has to engage Russia in hybrid warfare. And I think until Europe has the determination to retaliate against Russia in various capabilities, the nuclear coercion and extortion will continue.
Sorry, we
And
haven't got these capabilities because we have to abide by our rules. There are certain limits for democracies. Sorry. I
Okay.
have to intervene.
Your point is well taken.
So
Appreciate it, but let's
if you
continue
interrupt
for the
me again,
moment.
if you're going to interrupt me again, I'm going to leave, okay? I'm not going to tolerate that a third time. We can have a debate during the Q&A. I didn't interrupt you. You don't interrupt me. And on Weimar Plus, we have an opportunity here to integrate Ukraine systematically into Weimar Plus. If we already have Spain, the UK, and Italy on side, Why aren't we bringing Ukraine into that conversation? Again, to show that Ukraine is permanently integrated into the European political, military, and economic architecture. There are three scenarios that might happen here. Putin engages in some capacity, and the Americans are fully on side. Putin engages some capacity, and the Americans are somewhat on side and support Europe, or Putin engages and the Americans are not on side. Putin, since 2007, has been socializing a narrative that Europe cannot defend itself on its own. I'm confident, and when I listened to General Klein earlier, I'm confident that if Putin engages today and there was no American support, that Europe would win that fight. What I'm not confident about is that if Putin attacks 2, 3, or 5 years from now, that Europe will win that fight and is prepared to win that fight. So that's ultimately, I think, what we need to prepare for. And I think that Europe is fully capable of doing that. So let's not buy into the Russian narrative. And so how do we do this? Europe needs to position itself to deter. Europe needs to be able to defend, but Europe also needs to be able to strike. I was with a member of European Parliament from one of the Baltic states who told me that at least one of the Baltic states, if the Russians have a buildup on the Russian side, they won't do to make the mistake that the Ukrainians did and wait for Russia to attack, that they'll be prepared to take long-range precision weapons and go after Russian supply lines. And of course, that had always been the NATO plan during the Cold War in terms of disabling Russian supply lines. So I think there's ways that we can position ourselves robustly for the scenarios that await us. And I think we can do it with the United States, but Europe is also fully capable of doing it on its own.
Thank you. For the sake of time, I will not have an initial question, but just to maybe say something a little bit about the responses to increasingly brazen hybrid campaigns by Russia. The EU does have a new approach to Russia's hybrid campaigns. It's not a public one, but asymmetric responses are word of the day. Because yes, we don't want to go the way that Russians are going. We don't want to cyber attack hospitals. We don't want to set storage area sites on fire. But there are ways that we can respond asymmetrically in order to deter future attacks by Russia. And this is sort of type of thinking in Brussels these days, as far as I understand. Let's now go to our last speaker, François-Marie Gougeon, who perhaps will address specifically the issue of the changing patterns, European security architecture.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. I will skip considerations on Ukraine scenario because a lot has already been said. So for the sake of time, I will really focus on the impact on our overall security architecture and the way we see it from NATO standpoint. What I would like to offer is maybe start looking at the drivers of change, and a lot of them are already you are probably already familiar with, but I think it's important to recall them before we look at elements of continuity to look at the art of the possible and the challenges that that lie ahead for the transatlantic security. The drivers of change. Well, you've all read the very concise 1-page, 5-paragraph Hague Declaration, that whereby allies, especially Europeans and Canadians, or non-US allies, commit to spend more and rebuild their collective defense system and their capabilities by spending more resources, especially financial resources. So 3.5% of GDP by 2035 with continuous growth rates. So in essence, Europe is agreeing to rearm itself, not only from a financial perspective, but also to support the development, the build-up of our collective industrial capacity. That's the first thing. So it is a recognition by non-US allies that they need to take a more responsible role in defending themselves and in their deterrence and defense. That's the first thing. The second thing we're observing, which I'm seeing on a day-to-day basis in Brussels at NATO headquarters, is that there is a more clear-cut distribution of roles and responsibilities between NATO and EU, both institutions recognize that the goal is to support collective defense. And I have like almost weekly dialogues with the different directorates of the Commission, be it DEFIS, Home, MOVE, to support all the areas, or to have a better connection and better understanding and better mutual support in all those areas where EU can bring to bear what NATO lacks, in essence, financial resources, incentives to nations, but also its normative power. So all this now is well in place. And again, as I was just telling you, we have a staff dialogue, almost weekly staff dialogue, to make sure that whatever the EU does is aligned with what NATO does, in a sense, collective defence, and the operational plans that nations will have to execute. The third driver of change, and that's been very clear from our US ally, is that they are going forward with burden shifting. They expect Europeans and Canada, mostly Europeans, to take a bigger share of the burden of collective defence. They've made this very clear. This is not new. It's been a trend for years, for almost a decade now. So there's been a diminishing part of US forces in NATO's defence plans, but this is likely to accelerate in the coming years due to other priorities in the US for the US. So we will have to face a NATO with less US presence and less US forces and less US capabilities. Therefore, it is again the responsibility of European allies to pick up the slack and make sure that there is no gap in our deterrence and defence, and hopefully to do it in a structured and coordinated way. The fourth thing is, it is absolutely clear that we will have to support Ukraine for the long term, which means that not only do we have to take care of rebuilding our collective defence system, but we will have to dedicate a significant share of our budgets to keep supporting Ukraine and the build-up of Ukraine's armed forces and the build-up of Ukraine's defence industry. That has to be integral in our defence policies, and I think this is well understood amongst NATO allies. And the last thing is that at The Hague there was a clear confirmation of the validity of Article 5. That's in the first paragraph. But at the same time, we're all conscious that what we assumed used to be the security architecture in terms of strategic stability or support to strategic stability in Europe is now completely dismantled, and at some point will have to be rebuilt. I mean, the last example was the INF Treaty, but we have other upcoming challenges in terms of proliferation. So we will have to rebuild this, but recognizing at the same time that there is limited bandwidth for those considerations at the same for the moment, both in Europe and obviously also with Russia. So those are the drivers of change. How do we make sure that we have a strong deterrence and defence of the Euro-Atlantic area with potentially or likely less US forces, less US capabilities, and more European ownership? If I look now at the drivers or elements of continuity, architecture is nothing without structures. And the reason why we have the structures that we have today, with NATO on the one hand and the EU on the other hand, but mostly looking at NATO, and the reason why there is a US prominent role in NATO structures is linked to two factors. First of all, the ultimate guarantor of Euro-Atlantic security is the US strategic deterrent. This is absolutely clear. And that's the glue that holds the entire alliance together. Therefore, it is reassuring that the new succor is again a US succor and not from another nation. The reason why, the ultimate reason why there has to be a US succor is because of the US strategic deterrent. Those forces and escalation and management between the use of DCA capability, so dual capable aircraft capability, in essence, low level or limited employment of tactical weapons, and the articulation with the strategic deterrent has to be under a single hat, and that will have to remain a US hat because those are assets that belong to the US, ultimately. Of course, complemented by the independent nuclear deterrence from the US, from UK and France, but the keystone of the architecture remains the US strategic deterrent. That's one reason for, again, the US preeminence in NATO structures. The other reason, which is going to be a challenge of its own in the coming years, is that the US are providing and will keep providing some of the exquisite capabilities that we absolutely need to execute the defense plans of Europe and or the Euro-Atlantic area. And those belong to the US and are provided only by the US. And those will be very hard to replace in terms of C4 ISR capabilities, in terms of Intel fusion and multi-layered Intel and Intel fusion capabilities, and also deep precision strike and targeting capabilities. Those will be extremely hard to replace because no European nations has those capabilities. And therefore, what we are likely to see is that the US, because they bring in those exquisite capabilities that really make a difference in deterrence and defense, the US role will remain prominent in NATO's C2 structures because that's the link between those US capabilities and NATO, which is the reason why you will likely keep having dual-hatted US commanders in NATO precisely because they can then bring in those capabilities and operate those capabilities in support of NATO plans. So those are the two parameters which explain to you why we might have a changing landscape for Europe's security architecture, but we are likely to stay with likely the structures that we have, maybe or likely with a bit more European hats and European leaders within it, but with a strong US presence. I would also recall that the current security architecture that we have will face an enduring Russian threat, which means that it would be very dangerous to change the architecture and decide all of a sudden that we will go for something completely different, something that would be, for instance, EU-led. I mean, I think we would be deluding ourselves if we think that it would not create a fantastic opportunity for Vladimir Putin to test the solidity of a new architecture that would be built as we fly, in essence. So we have strong tools. We may want to rebalance the weight of the different contributions in those structures, in those tools, but I would strongly caution against any illusion that we could create something robust enough to deter Putin by changing completely the system that we have now. I will conclude with one last point. So the first challenge will be to Europeanize NATO. And I think we have the right tools for this. We have something that's called the NATO defense planning process, which I'm responsible for, which in essence disputes roles and responsibilities and the burden of capabilities in support of operational plans in a way that is consistent with SACEUR's needs. So I think on that side, we have a good process to do this in a collegial way, and all decisions being based on consensus, I think we have a robust way forward. What I think, and to build on what's just been said, where we see that we have a challenge is that we have to shift from a mindset of a defensive alliance relying on a purely defensive posture. We have to shift the mindset towards an alliance that understands better the logics of escalation management, and the ability to assume a more proactive deterrence posture. Meaning that we have to use all the tools that are available that we can leverage, be it in the military domain or outside the military domain, to precisely keep putting pressure on Russia and on Vladimir Putin, but by assuming a way more, I wouldn't say offensive, but deliberate and thought out deterrence way of exercising deterrence in order to prevent that we at some point cross the threshold of defense. And I will just leave it there.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. Just maybe a point of clarification. Would that mean, building more European missiles, for example?
I think, given the current state of Europe's armed forces, there is room for pretty much everybody and every industry. There's going to be massive amounts of money flowing in, coming from nations themselves, but also coming from the EU. I think it's really promising to see the first development of the SAFE instrument. There's a large group of nations now knocking at the door and preparing projects for the SAFE instrument. So if you recall the SAFE instrument, it's 150 billions that will be made available at EU negotiated rates. So it's really interesting. The only point is that nations have to come with at least association of 2 nations on a project, and it also includes Ukraine. So it looks really promising. So to your question, I think the problem that we have is not to decide which country will get its return on investment on industry. It's to make sure that we build the right capacity, both in Europe and also with the support of the US base, because we need innovation, we need technology, and we also recognize that our transatlantic industries are closely interlinked. Therefore, we just want to make sure that the way this base develops supports our goals with less fragmentation maybe, but again, it's very likely that there will be money for everybody. There will be room for everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you. We have exactly 15 minutes to go for your questions and answers from the panel. We can collect a few, so I see 1, 2, 3, 4 hands up. So let's start with 4 gentlemen, starting with gentleman here in the first row. You can please identify yourself and ask a question or make a very brief comment.
Thank you. Retired French Air Force Major General Jean-Marc Vigilant. I used to be the director of the War College, and I served in Norfolk as well, in ACT, and with our American friends in the Middle East. I would like to make 2 comments and questions. First of all, Putin already internationalized the conflict, and therefore I think that the European Union, or the European in general, are too much thinking about the Ukraine conflict as a regional conflict, where or when the EU or the European together are a superpower, as it was told by General Hodges, with global interests. Therefore, I think that the thinking about our future architecture of security, we should think about it in a more global way, because all crises on the earth are interconnected. Something is happening in Asia or in Hormuz, we will feel the pain. Therefore, we have to think about it more thoroughly than what we're doing currently. And then I would like to have your thought on that point. The other thing is the fact. I mean, when you say, Mr. Gougeon, Jean-Marie, François-Marie, that NATO is everything, and we can't do anything without the US, I totally disagree. Because even if we have currently NATO, and we hope, and we have to hope for the best, but we have to plan for the worst. Currently, we have, with the current US administration, we have a strong divergence of the assessment of the threat. The current Trump administration doesn't see Russia as a threat. Therefore, even if we have the best NATO construct, we may not be able to use it. And we have to be prepared for this worst-case scenario. And I think that in the best case, the US might let us go, and in the worst case, they might prevent us from going. And we have to be ready for that. Therefore, I think that we have to increase our capacity, developing the European pillar within NATO as much as we can, with more capabilities, etc. But this has to be, I would say, a transitional phase to go to something much more, European and independent. And when I say independent, it's not against the US. It's to have the ability to really share burden, fight together with the US. And by the way, I would like maybe General Hodges to precise some thought I have. I understand that since the Kosovo War, the United States basically said our preferred way of military engagement is through coalition of the willing. And we might not put all our American forces under a military NATO commander who will have to report to the NAC. And I think that the most likely form of mutual engagement would be what we've seen in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya. It's a coalition between the US forces and the NATO forces. And for the US, NATO is primarily the gathering of the European forces. And then I would like to have your answer on whether it is true or not. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Let's continue with, you want to pass on? So then there was a gentleman over there and then in the back. Yeah.
So Markus Wölke, I'm a German diplomat now working for the Federal Academy for Security Policy. A question on the future of Ukraine. The most probable scenario is kind of a muddling through, kind of freezing, kind of whatever kind of thing. What about European integration? Because this was now very much kind of NATO or hard security oriented, but we cannot separate that from kind of the European pathway. So could you imagine a kind of de facto economic integration European-wise, which would be kind of a security guarantee?
Thank you for that question. Now, can we take the mic up to the back? The gentleman over there. Or if you can just speak very loudly, I guess we can hear you.
Thank you. Johan Briand, Institut EGEA. I have a short comment on Ukraine and a shorter question. So we've talked at length about Trump and the American support. But I think part of the problem is that Trump has been elected twice. And the thing is that it is very easy for a man and his team to confiscate basically the means of supporting Ukraine. If you look right now at Hungary or Slovakia, we can see that there's a 70-ish% of support for NATO and something close to that for Ukraine. But if you look at this through the lens of governments, it's very hard to see. So my question is, if you look at France in 2027, it doesn't matter what side you take, but it doesn't look good when it comes to defense spending and European defense. So my question is, we have the means of supporting Ukraine, okay, but what happens when we can't access those means?
Okay. Thank you. So we have a question on, let's say, domestic politics, on European integration of Ukraine, risks of divergence between the US and, say, European NATO, and whether we should have sort of more global approach to global security challenges, as NATO presumably, well, I guess. So I suggested we go from the end of the table, and please each of you take the questions that you like. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. First of all, on the way Russia is seen on both sides of the Atlantic, I would beg to disagree. The Hague Summit communique made it very clear, and that's been agreed and supported by all 32 allies, and President Trump was in the room, as well as all the other heads of state and government. Russia is, quote, we're united in the face of profound security threats and challenges, in particular the long-term threat posed by Russia to Euro-Atlantic security. So that's a clear commitment at the highest level. I mean, we can speculate on what's going on in the Beltway and in other capitals, but at the moment, there's been a reaffirmed statement that Russia poses a long-term threat to the Euro-Atlantic security. Second, we can do things, we can certainly do things as Europeans, but I'm afraid, I mean, this is an unclassified setting, so I can't share you the number of horror stories that I've seen in all our bilateral visits to the European countries. I think we are deluding ourselves severely if we think that we are capable of achieving anything significant in a protracted conflict against a battle-hardened Russia. Let's be very clear. We're missing some key capabilities that Russia is perfectly aware of and they would take advantage of if the US were not supporting us. And we lack the stocks, we lack the logistics, we lack a lot of things that are absolutely indispensable to fight a high-intensity conflict more than 2 weeks. Let's be absolutely clear. There's no way around it. And the time that we will take to rebuild that capacity, that capability, is counted not in months, but in years. It is likely that it's going to take 5 to 10 years. I mean, all the experts in the room with a bit of military experience in their own national military systems will probably share the same view. We all think that the neighbour will come to the rescue, but the neighbours are very much in the same state as we are, as you are. So it's going to take 5 to 10 years to reduce our level of dependence on the US. Absolutely fine. And I think that's the path that all Europeans are now embarked on, which is good news because I think that's precisely what the US are welcoming. That's what they're expecting. They're not saying that they want to shift the burden just for the sake of shifting the burden. They're telling us we have other pressing priorities. Our pacing challenge is China, and we have a domestic security situation at our borders that we want to take care of. Absolutely fine. So it's too early to say what NATO will look like in 5 to 10 years. But what we can be absolutely sure is that without a massive reinvestment into our collective defense by the Europeans, we will not be able to change NATO or our collective defense systems. So in terms of collective defense, there's no way around reinvesting, rebuilding our collective capabilities, and then we will see where we'll take NATO and how we will shift also the burden or have a better burden sharing in terms of strategic decision making and political decision making. But the first step is to rebuild, and then we'll see. I will just stop there.
Thank you. Karen.
J'apprécie ces commentaires et je suis complètement d'accord that on the threat picture, I'm not sure I agree that there's as much divergence. I think in official circles, we're seeing the same thing. I think that it's very important. I try to do it both for my own profession, but also for my personal mental well-being, to separate the politics and a little bit of the theater. President Trump a vraiment un style de communication vraiment unique. We can't be distracted by it. But looking at actual actions and then their underlying interests, I think, is helpful as a touchstone. And at least in the North American context, the massive investment that the Trump administration is proposing under a Golden Dome tells us that their threat perception is actually quite accurate and is quite sincere in the sense that they're not naive about the threats that are coming from multiple directions. I do absolutely agree, though, with the comment that Putin has internationalized the conflict, and we do need to look at it from a global perspective. Canada, being on the western frontier of NATO, naturally takes this view, and it informs how we approach Ukraine, it informs how we approach our own force development, and it will inform in the future how we approach our investments under the 5% commitment, which we are very clear about. We have to be very careful about how we escalate, how we manage escalation, and how we place our investments, because over-investment in one geographic location could make us vulnerable as allies or as a nation to other approaches from Russia, but also from some of Russia's friends and allies, and which makes victory in this long-term contest, which is probably the wrong frame of mind, but it makes victory or even a stabilization of the situation much more complicated than it might seem if we're thinking about Ukraine as an isolated crisis. We need to be thinking about this as a long-term campaign and a reshaping for the long term of our security realities, again, as allies and as individual nations. So I absolutely agree with that. I also agree with the comment about European integration of Ukraine. And I will say, as a Canadian official, it's not my place nor my area of expertise to suggest the relationship that's required between European Union and Ukraine specifically. But certainly for Canada, we see a lot of value in, regardless of battlefield developments, for the longer term, encouraging and facilitating the integration of Ukraine into Euro-Atlantic structures, of which we are a part, as well as Canadian structures, which is, again, why we are enthusiastic supporters of UNSATU. It's why we agree with many other allies about the need to integrate our defense industrial bases But even aside from the benefits to Ukraine, the kind of transformation that François-Marie is talking about in terms of benefits to NATO, of learning from the Ukrainian experience, is also very real and can only come through deeper integration. So I agree that I don't know if it's an alternative path, but it's part of the mix of what success could look like in the longer term.
Thank you. Christian.
This is probably a good opportunity to pick up sort of the bilateral conversation that we had here, and it ties in with the first question, which I think is a very apt question. The point that I was trying to illustrate is that Europe doesn't have the instruments of statecraft that it ultimately needs, and some of those need to be instruments that it might never use, right? I mean, neither France nor the United Kingdom have used their nuclear deterrent capabilities. But that doesn't mean that there's certain asymmetric capabilities that it might not be useful for Europe to be able to display explicitly, simply to make Putin guess about what might Europe be prepared to do. And what Europe might be prepared to do depends very much on what the relationship with the US in those situations might look like. And Europe, in a way, is further ahead than we give it credit, right? So the strategic compass in 2022, which was neither about strategy, nor was it much of a compass. But it was an incredible accomplishment for the European Union, because for the first time in European history did you overcome the transaction costs and have all European countries agree on a threat picture. And now that you actually have a threat picture, because there's no point in trying to build a security architecture if you don't have a common understanding of what the threat picture looks like. So I do, these evolutions take time, but I think they are happening, and they're happening at an accelerated pace because now the means are available to help build out some of that architecture. But as I also mentioned during my remarks, given the way Russia can impose strategic dilemmas across a host of regions and a host of domains, it's absolutely important to have that global perspective. As you know, one key example is Russia's meddling in Africa to generate migratory flows to Europe. On the divergence and threat assessment, I wonder whether it's an inference that we draw from that, right? So, look, every administration since George W. Bush has tried to reset relationships with Russia and China, right? So this is not new. It's just the rather odious way in which the current president goes about things that sort of rattles people. But this and the overreach in the first 100 days by U.S. president is also not new. Every U.S. president does that. And there's, General Hodges can correct me, but there are, but there are very real concerns in the United States about certain stocks and the ability to regenerate those stocks, in particular in an assessment in a world where Putin might march on one of the European countries in the next 2 to 3 years, and China might march on Taiwan, and you have conflict in the Middle East. This is, again, not to apologize for Trump, but I think there are rational considerations behind this. On the question about the future of Ukraine, that's my Weimar Plus proposal. Systematically integrate Ukraine into the structures that Europe has already built, and I suspect that might be the easiest way to get sort of consensus on integrating Ukraine initially, and then sort of build out Ukrainian integration more broader into European structures. And the means, I brought this up yesterday, right? So France faces a budget deficit of 7% of GDP. The US budget deficit is about to grow so the US in the current fiscal year, US revenue is 24% of GDP, federal government expenditures are 29% of GDP. That delta with the current budget bill is going to grow from 5% to 8%. And you can see the effects of those, right? So the US is down from 4 million troops under arms 25 years ago to 3 million troops today. In 2000, 15% of US troops were deployed abroad. In 2025, 8% of US troops are deployed abroad. And so we see the real consequences that necessarily has for the European theater and for other theaters, and for the US efforts, I think, to concentrate and to maximize and optimize the resources and the means at its disposal. And one way, of course, that Europe can counter some of that, there was lots of talk about fragmentation, but let's look at the real cost of fragmentation. The real cost of fragmentation is that Europe, per piece of equipment, pays 2 to 4 times, and Canada pay 2 to 4 times as much as the United States for the same piece of equipment. Look at what, I think the 17 different tanks and the 18 pieces, different artillery pieces in Europe, right? Whereas, you know, the US gets economies of scale, and so we need to understand what the trade-offs are of that fragmentation. And if we don't have a lot of money, how do we get the best value for that money?
Thanks.
So the best thing I've heard today was from Deputy Secretary General Gougeon talking about the alliance, thinking more in terms of, you didn't use the word initiative, but that's what I heard. The idea of don't just sit back and wait to be hit and then respond, but there are things that the alliance could do that would help deter, that would involve using initiative. And I think every commander always wants to get the initiative. No, don't sit and wait to be attacked, but having the initiative, and obviously working with at 32 nations. So that was encouraging. The second thing I'd mentioned that is lost in all the conversations about Ukraine since it began, not just on 2022, but even after the invasion in 2014, the objective. And I'm sure here in the École Militaire, every student is taught the importance of you must identify the objective. Every list of principles of war, no matter what language, what book it's in, there will always be the importance of identify the aim, the objective, the purpose. What the hell are we trying to accomplish? And I'd never hear any clear explanation from my president or any other leaders. What is our end state? What's the objective we're trying to accomplish with Ukraine, the collective we? Negotiation is not an objective. Helping get Ukraine in a better negotiating position, that's not an objective. We're with you for as long as it takes, that's not an objective. And I think, and I'm lucky to be on a panel here with two people who specialize in planning and policy, it's impossible to develop effective policy if you don't have a clearly defined objective. And I think that's been our problem. That's why we had so many bad policies in the last administration and the preceding administrations as well as the current one, because we haven't clearly defined our objective. Then you end up with stupid things like, here we'll let you have HIMARS, but you can't shoot at the place where the enemy's attacking you from. You know, that's bad policy because we didn't have an objective. The third thing that I would mention is, and Carrie, I'm not going to say you mischaracterized what I said intentionally, but you said you referred to economic tools as a silver bullet. I did not mean to convey that. What I'm saying is that the use of economic tools are part of how we put pressure on Russia. The only way they will ever come to the negotiating table is when the oligarchs are screaming and Putin realizes that he cannot sell oil and gas to Russia anymore, to China and India anymore, and he has no option but to negotiate to stop the pressure. And this is part of Europe's contribution, because every stinking Shadow Fleet vessel has to go out through the Baltic Sea, which is completely controlled or could be controlled by NATO countries, or through the Black Sea, which also is conveniently controlled by our Turkish ally. And then they go out into the Aegean and transload the oil into more seaworthy vessels right under the nose of the Greek Navy. So these are things that we can do that would force Russia to the table if we wanted to. Now, I would slightly disagree with the Deputy Secretary General about the capacity of Europe to get serious about the war. I visited the EDA about a year and a half ago, and I was told by a very senior person there, he said about 50% of the ammunition that is produced in Europe goes to customers outside of Europe. So while we're all wringing our hands like, oh my God, we cannot make enough ammunition, actually half of what is made goes to Uganda, where it's bought by a large Russian company, or it goes to the UAE, where there is some front organization that hoovers up as much as they can and then resells it to other people. So there is a lot of capacity, more capacity out there. And of course, most companies, most countries don't openly talk about what they actually have or what they can do, probably including my own. This notion that the reason that the current administration turned off weapons and ammunition to Ukraine is because all of a sudden we realize we don't have enough That is a total fairy tale. That is an absolute fairy tale. Of course, we don't have enough, but that's not why they turned it off. And when we got serious about, I remember 2 years ago, I was on an ammunition project, and I talked to the guy in charge of ammo at the Pentagon. He said we were making about 15,000 rounds of 155 ammunition per month for the U.S. because that's our training requirement. We shoot about 15,000 rounds a month for Army and Marine Corps artillery training. When Secretary Austin said, well, we need a lot more than that, and they put a big giant pile of money on it, it quadrupled inside of a year. So it always comes down to political will. And I think if you go to 1942, when Churchill and Roosevelt said, we have got to defeat Nazi Germany first. Germany first. Even though it was Japan that attacked the United States, no Americans wanted to go to war in Europe because they were all first, second, third generation immigrants from Europe. And they said, we left that. We don't want to go back there and fight. But Roosevelt and Churchill got together and clearly identified the objective, defeat Nazi Germany first. And then the U.S. Army, which was 17th in the world, right behind Bulgaria, in 3.5 years had 12 million women and men in uniform. 3.5 years. And Ford Motor Company quit making cars and they made Army trucks. And Westinghouse quit making refrigerators because nobody was going to be buying one for the next few years. They made machine guns. This was all from political will. That's what Europe doesn't have. Political will. They have plenty of factories. They have thousands of people that are ready to go to work. But the political will and the vision and maybe the self-confidence to do what needs to be done to defeat Russia, defeat them, make them live in their own borders, and then your kids and grandkids we can all go to the Hermitage in St. Petersburg and enjoy incredible Russian culture and caviar.
Brilliant. So please join me in thanking our speakers in this panel. Very lively discussion. And I understand that we go directly to the last point of the program. So, yeah.
Bien. Mesdames et messieurs les officiers généraux, mesdames et messieurs, dear guests, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, avant de conclure ce séminaire et de laisser la parole au contre-amiral Bertrand Dumoulin pour le mot de clôture, permettez-moi d'adresser quelques mots de remerciement. Bevor wir dieses Seminar abschließen und das Wort zum Schluss an Konteradmiral Bertrand Dumoulin übergeben, erlauben Sie mir bitte ein paar Dankesworte auszusprechen. Merci tout d'abord aux co-organisateurs, l'IRSEM et l'Acadème, ainsi qu'au programme MINDS du ministère canadien de la Défense nationale pour leur soutien déterminant. Merci également à l'ensemble de nos partenaires institutionnels, industriels et académiques, dont la contribution a été essentielle à la tenue de ces 2 journées d'échanges exigeants. Je souhaite saluer avec une gratitude toute particulière le travail de l'équipe du Forum de défense et de stratégie, Zineb El-Meyani, Charline Hutin, Théodora Morosanou, Marie Gué, dont l'engagement a été précieux à chaque étape de l'organisation. Un chaleureux remerciement également aux équipes techniques, aux interprètes ainsi qu'aux techniciens qui ont garanti le bon déroulement du programme sans accroc. This trilateral format is not meant to be a one-time event. We truly hope to organize it again next year, maybe in Berlin or in Canada, in Ottawa, or even in Quebec, perhaps in Montreal, given the presence of a NATO Center of Excellence, to keep this three-way dialogue going across the Atlantic. D'ici là, une séquence de suivi est déjà prévue à l'automne à Ottawa, toujours en format Chatham House et panel ouvert, et réunissant non seulement des intervenants canadiens, français et allemands, mais aussi d'autres nationalités issues de l'espace euro-atlantique. We look forward to continuing this conversation across continents, across perspectives. Pour conclure ce séminaire, j'ai l'honneur de céder la parole maintenant pour le mot de conclusion au contre-amiral Bertrand Dumoulin, secrétaire général de l'Académie de défense de l'école militaire et officier général adjoint au directeur de l'enseignement militaire supérieur, mais aussi qui fut par le passé préfet maritime de l'Atlantique, directeur de l'école navale et commandant du sous-marin nucléaire lanceur d'engins Le Terrible. Amiral, je vous laisse la parole.
Merci, cher Laurent Borzillo. Thank you very much. C'est pour moi un honneur de conclure ce beau colloque. It is an honor for me to close this forum. J'ai été très impressionné par le haut niveau des tables rondes auxquelles j'ai assisté, notamment hier, et par la qualité des intervenants. I've been very impressed by the quality of the panels. Now I'm going to shift in French for my closing remark. Je trouve que le thème du forum, le lien transatlantique, est vraiment très pertinent. Et nous avons beaucoup parlé des pays de part et d'autre de l'Atlantique, avec la nécessité de faire des choses ensemble dans le contexte troublé que nous connaissons. Permettez-moi néanmoins un petit aparté, moi qui suis marin. Il y a certes les pays qui sont de part et d'autre, mais il y a aussi l'Atlantique, le théâtre atlantique lui-même, qui est un théâtre clé, où il se passe beaucoup de choses, à la fois sur l'eau, mais aussi sous l'eau. Et je tiens juste à souligner le fait que nos pays, les puissances occidentales, nos pays respectifs, s'organisent souvent pour se coordonner et surveiller les mouvements des forces russes en Atlantique, notamment les mouvements sous-marins. Je pense par exemple aux avions de patrouille maritime canadiens. Et donc cette coopération, elle est déjà étroite dans ce théâtre qui est un théâtre clé où depuis longtemps, déjà pendant la guerre froide, mais depuis longtemps, les grandes puissances se testent dans un théâtre immense qui n'appartient à personne, puisque la mer n'est pas la propriété d'une nation. La mer est un théâtre de liberté, et donc c'est important de savoir ce que les autres font de ce théâtre. Voilà pour cet aparté sur ce qu'est l'Atlantique, dans lequel j'ai passé de nombreuses heures de ma vie. Je voudrais revenir de manière un peu plus générale sur les bouleversements actuels que vous connaissez bien. Je crois que je vous apprendrai rien en vous parlant de remise en cause du droit international, en vous parlant de multiplication des crises, d'accélération du tempo stratégique, de désinhibition de la force, et puis aussi, il faut le dire, d'un réarmement mondial. On a parlé beaucoup, après le sommet de l'OTAN, des 5%, qui sont un engagement des différents pays de l'OTAN pour 2035. Mais il faut mettre ça en relation avec le pourcentage du PIB qu'utilisent nos compétiteurs ou nos adversaires. La Russie est aujourd'hui à 7% de son PIB pour la défense. Alors, quand on dit ça, on se dit, on a tendance à se dire, est-ce que nous, on en est loin? Ça peut être une source de pessimisme. Mais si on regarde les chiffres, combien dépensent l'ensemble des pays européens à leur défense? C'est 326 milliards d'euros. La Russie dépense 149 milliards de dollars. C'est à peu près pareil, hein, c'est 1,1, donc si on fait la comparaison. Donc si nous réussissons à nous entendre, eh bien l'espoir peut renaître. Alors, ce que je voudrais dire, c'est que dans ce contexte d'instabilité, d'incertitude, que je décrivais sans m'étendre à travers tous ces points qui traduisent un monde incertain, avec des crises qui se multiplient, eh bien on note plusieurs approches, plusieurs visions du monde. Il y a d'abord la vision historique, la vision auquel vous êtes attachés, auquel les pays, j'allais dire, de la vieille Europe, entre guillemets, les pays comme le Canada sont attachés. C'est cette vision de la paix par le droit, par le respect du droit international. Et puis il y a d'autres visions. Il y a la vision de la paix par la force armée. Et puis il y a encore d'autres visions. La paix par, j'allais dire, le développement inclusif, développement économique, mais pas seulement, qui est peut-être plus l'apanage de la Chine. Et tout ça, je veux dire, tout ça nous oblige nous qui sommes attachés au droit international. Alors ça nous oblige et ça nous interroge sur ce que nous sommes, sur nos valeurs, sur ce que nous voulons défendre et avec qui nous voulons le faire. Alors je crois que nos valeurs, je le disais, hein, c'est effectivement, vous le savez, c'est ce respect du droit international, c'est le fait que le respect de la souveraineté des États, et c'est ce que nous avons à défendre. Alors il y a bien d'autres choses aussi, je vais pas faire je n'ai pas la prétention de faire un cours sur les valeurs, chacun y a réfléchi, chacun le sait, nos pays respectifs ont une histoire, ont des valeurs communes, se sont retrouvés dans l'histoire, côte à côte, pour défendre ces valeurs. Et puis, il y a comment les défendre et avec qui. Et je crois que dans tout ce qui a été dit, pour défendre ce respect du droit international auquel nous sommes attachés, je crois que l'Allemagne et le Canada partagent ces valeurs. Et donc, c'est avec eux que nous pouvons faire cela. Alors comment le faire? Eh bien là, je vais pas. Il faudrait des heures, et je crois que ce colloque a ouvert bien des perspectives. Mais je voudrais insister sur un point qui est important. C'est il faut le faire, je crois, avec nos opinions publiques, avec nos concitoyens. Et ça, c'est important. Et je crois qu'on a une richesse à défendre, on a des valeurs à défendre, et que donc on a tout pour embarquer, si je puis dire, pardonnez-moi, c'est l'expression de marin, mais pour embarquer nos concitoyens. Et ça me paraît très important dans cette époque troublée, que de garder des repères et de les partager avec nos concitoyens. Et ici, à l'école militaire, l'Académie de défense de l'école militaire a à cœur, à sa modeste place, justement de faire rayonner et de faire partager cette réflexion. Et donc, moi, je vous remercie beaucoup de ce colloque de haute qualité qu'on était ravis d'accueillir. Merci encore, mon cher Laurent. Et puis, on était très heureux d'avoir la présence de son Excellence, l'ambassadeur du Canada en France, et puis des parlementaires. Et je crois que cela augure bien de la suite de nos échanges. Je peux déjà vous annoncer que les 24, 25 et 26 mars 2026, nous aurons ici même un grand forum, le Paris Defense Strategic Forum, qui sera un rendez-vous international important. Cette année, vous savez, nous avons eu à peu près 4000 visiteurs, dont la moitié visiteurs étrangers, avec des hautes personnalités. L'idée, c'est quoi? C'est de pouvoir débattre des questions de souveraineté, de pouvoir débattre des questions de partenariat. Parce qu'aujourd'hui, et je crois vous en avoir apporté la preuve dans ces quelques mots, eh bien, on ne peut pas faire les choses tout seul, évidemment, et nous avons des choses en commun à défendre. Voilà, donc ce que je voulais vous inviter déjà, et donc si jamais vous ne recevez rien, eh bien adressez-vous à Laurent, bien sûr à Laurent Berdigeau, à ce magnifique forum qui permettra de continuer nos échanges et de faire en sorte aussi que cette voix qui défend notre histoire, qui défend ce que nous sommes, hein, puisque le contexte international nous interroge sur ce que nous sommes, sur nos valeurs, sur ce que nous avons à défendre et sur comment le faire et avec qui. Et l'idée, bien sûr, c'est de le faire avec vous. Et donc, je vous donne rendez-vous en mars prochain. Et encore un grand merci et ravi de vous avoir accueilli. Et je vous présente aussi peut-être mes excuses pour le labyrinthe, quelquefois puisqu'on est en période de travaux, pour arriver dans le bon amphi. C'est un peu compliqué. Vous savez qu'on a la chance d'avoir un site qui est magnifique, un site historique qui a été construit du temps de Louis XV, puisque on s'est aperçu qu'il fallait former les chefs militaires et que si les chefs militaires se devaient d'avoir une formation de qualité. Donc ici, on a eu des élèves comme Napoléon. On a d'ailleurs ses copies, donc je ne vais pas vous faire je ne vais pas vous les montrer, mais je pense qu'elles devaient être de bonne qualité. Il y a eu d'autres personnages illustres, Joffre, Foch, qui sont passés par ces rangs ici, sur ce site. Et donc tout ça pour vous dire que effectivement nous on en est assez fiers, mais en revanche dès qu'on veut faire le moindre travail, les monuments historiques interviennent. Ça ralentit, et donc il y a des travaux partout qui prennent du temps, et donc je m'excuse pour le désagrément et le labyrinthe, quelquefois pour trouver le bon amphithéâtre, c'est parfois compliqué, et j'en suis désolé. En tout cas, un grand merci, et je crois que ce colloque a été très riche, et je suis très honoré, au nom du général de Courrèges, qui est le président de l'Académie de Défense de l'école militaire, de le conclure. Thank you very much everybody, and thank you on behalf of Général de Courrèges.